Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Wistrand, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute. Thank you for joining us for a discussion of Making Socialism Work, Economic Reform, and the Soviet Enterprise, 1960s to 2000s. Before I introduce our guests, I'd like to remind you that you can stay up to date on the Kennan Institute's activities by visiting the Kennan Institute's website and subscribing to our blogs and podcasts and other publications. I'd also like to take a moment to thank the Department of State's Title VIII program for its generous support of a number of the Kennan Institute's fellowships. These fellowships allow us to support rising scholars in the field, including today's guest, Dr. James Nealy. Dr. James Nealy received his PhD from Duke University in May 2022. His area of expertise is the social, economic, and intellectual history of the Soviet Union. His writing has appeared in places such as Kritika, Revolutionary Russia, and Contemporary European History. He's the co-editor of the forthcoming volume, Soviet Workers in the World, Soviet Labor and Working Class History in Global Context. Dr. Nealy is currently a postdoctoral fellow with the Jordan Center for Advanced Study of Russia at New York University. So after our guest speaks, there's going to be a question and answer period. For our online audience, if you would like to ask a question, you can do so in one of three ways. You may submit your question via email, so kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter @Kennan Institute, or via Facebook. And for our online audience, please remember to include your name and affiliation when submitting your questions. And for our in-person audience, if you have a microphone near you, please turn it on when you speak. And if you don't have a microphone, if someone nearby can pass one to you so that we make sure everyone can hear the questions. Finally, today's discussion is being recorded. So James, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, Jennifer. Thank you also, everyone, for being here. I want to say this is a little bittersweet for me because it means that my tenure here has come to an end. And I've made a lot of great friends here and had a lot of great conversations. So I hope I will continue those relationships for a long time. So my talk today is called Making Socialism Work, Economic Reform in the Soviet Enterprise, 1960s through the 2000s. This presentation is pulled out of the penultimate chapter of a book that I'm writing on economic reform in the Soviet Union on the level of the enterprise during the late 20th century. I want to start with this poster that I found at the Fung Library at Harvard University. It's from 1974. I'll ask you to keep in mind this poster as we move through. Up on the top left corner, you'll see a quote, and it says, "If we keep so many on payroll, this will impede our progress and slow our stride. Redundant staff must step aside." So I'll ask you to just keep that in mind as we move through the presentation because it nicely sums up what the economic reforms that I study were attempting to accomplish. So during this talk, I'm going to first tell you where this topic came from. Why am I studying this? Second, I'm going to present an overview of the data. I will also tell you what sort of data I'm using. And then I'll close by telling you why I think this research matters to multiple audiences. So where'd the project come from? When I was a graduate student, I came across a couple of tendencies in contemporary historiography that really bothered me. The first was this concept of stagnation. So there's this tendency in scholarship in the major European languages to refer to the period between roughly 1964 and roughly 1985 as an area of stagnation when the Soviet economy and its society effectively stopped evolving. This did not sit right with me. First, the concept of stagnation was introduced by Mikhail Gorbachev in the mid-1980s to describe the tenure of his predecessor, Leonid Brezhnev. Considering the Soviet tradition of critiquing predecessors, I immediately was a little suspicious. Second, by the mid-1970s, the Soviet Union had the second largest economy in the world, the largest military in the world, the fourth largest population in the world, and by far the largest territory in the world. As my advisor, Anna Krylova, asked in an influential 2014 essay, how is it possible that a place like this just stops changing? The second thing that bothered me is what we think we know about something called the Kosygin Reform. Named after the Prime Minister of the Soviet Union, Alexei Kosygin, the Kosygin Reform of 1965 was a set of policies designed to grant enterprises more independence from state planners in Moscow. It suggested that managers pursue profit, profitability, and production quality on the level of the enterprise. This alone was not new. Soviet economists thought seriously about all these metrics from the origins of the Soviet state. But support for using them as part of a comprehensive strategy to improve economic performance really grew after Stalin's death in 1953, and in my view, culminated with the Kosygin Reform of 1965. The established narrative of the Kosygin Reform goes something like this, and it is consistent, the established narrative is consistent with the stagnation trope. The Kosygin Reform was announced in late 1965. It was introduced in earnest in early 1966, but by 1968, the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia prompted a conservative backlash within the Soviet Union that put an end to any sort of tolerance for experimentation. The Kosygin Reform subsequently vanished from the pages of major publications, and thus so did the reform itself. But this is just bad methodology on the part of scholars. First, the Kosygin Reform was designed first and foremost to change the behavior of enterprises, not directly Moscow, so attempting to judge its effectiveness using documents from nationwide institutions and media simply makes no sense. Second, on the level of the factory, the Kosygin Reform was not called the Kosygin Reform at all. It was called the new method of planning and economic incentivization. And this terminology had a very significant lifespan. There was even a sub-department called, and for those of you who have studied the Soviet Union seriously, you will be very familiar with this. For those who have not, strap yourself in because it's a very long title. There's the sub-department called the Interdepartmental Commission of the State Planning Committee of the Council of Ministers of the USSR on the transfer of industrial enterprises to the new system of planning and economic incentivization. And this sub-department was still transferring factories to the Kosygin Reform in 1986. Third, there remains a conviction, especially in Anglophone historiography, that for the Soviets to build socialism, they had to create something fundamentally different from capitalism. And yes, private property, rule of law, financial institutions, markets, a convertible currency. The Soviet economy was, of course, very different from a capitalist economy. But the Soviet Union also borrowed many, many technologies from the West. These include literal technologies that were reverse engineered on the factory floor, but also social technologies like wage differentials and production processes. So in my view, there had to have been some sort of commonalities between the two, and I wanted to know how extensive and long-lived were these similarities. So these are the sorts of issues that were on my mind when I set out to find a topic for the dissertation that would become this manuscript. One day, during a preliminary research trip to the State Archive of the Russian Federation in Moscow in 2017, I stumbled across a report that had been sent to the Council of Ministers that described something called the Shchekino method, which entailed the dismissal of thousands of workers at various factories in the Tula region. The Tula region is south of Moscow. Capital is Tula, which is approximately 250 kilometers south of Moscow. I was very confused. Nothing in contemporary historiography suggested that anything like this was possible until the mid-1980s. So I decided to follow that story to see where it would take me. Now I'm going to tell you about where I arrived. A direct offshoot of the 1965 Kosygin Reform, the Shchekino method began at the Shchekino Chemical Combine in the city of Shchekino in the Tula region. I just told you a bit about where Tula is. Shchekino is about 15 kilometers south of Tula. Its claim to fame is Yasna Polyana, the estate of the legendary author Lev Tolstoy. A very beautiful place. So it began in 1967. Designed to rationalize the production process, the method permitted industrial leaders to reassign workers to perform multiple jobs or to dismiss them while maintaining the entirety of the wage fund afforded to the factory by state planners. According to Peter Sharov, the then director of the factory, within 4 years of the establishment of the method, 1,039 of the 6,800 workers at the combine had been dismissed from employment, labor productivity had risen by 226%, wages had grown by 36%, and funds from the experiment had been used to build a hospital, 2 schools, and 30,000 square meters worth of new housing. The combination of work responsibilities was widespread. One manager at the combine reported that by 1969, a majority of the workers at the factory knew 2 or 3 professions, and in some cases, personnel had mastered as many as 6. All right, I know that's a mouthful, so let me explain in very simple terms how the Shchekino method functioned. Let's pretend that I am the director of a Soviet factory, and my wage fund, that is the total sum afforded to me to pay workers, is 100 rubles. And now let's pretend that I have 100 workers in my factory. And let's imagine that they're all paid the same. Soviets didn't do this. Wage leveling was against the rules, but let's just pretend for the sake of simplicity. Now let's imagine that I have one worker quit for whatever reason. Now I have 100 rubles, 99 workers. Under the old style, I have to send back a ruble to the state bank. What the Shchekino method did was it allowed me to keep the entirety of my wage fund irrespective of the number of workers who are at my factory. So now let's pretend I lose 25 people. Now I have a 25 ruble surplus. I would use that surplus in one of 3 ways. 1, bonuses that go back to workers. 2, investment in social amenities like kindergartens, camps, gyms, and so on. Or 3, the rubles could go back to improve capital, investment in the capital stock to improve production. So that's how it worked in very simple terms. The Shchekino method was certainly important in the Tula region. It was not, however, confined there. In 1969, the Communist Party Central Committee announced its support for the spread of the Shchekino method to other factories, industries, and regions in the Soviet Union. Between 1967 and 1971, no guidelines actually existed to manage the process of applying the method. As a result, enterprises used it on an impromptu basis and typically took liberties to adapt it to suit their own needs. By the early 1970s, it was impossible to speak of a single Shchekino method. Well, what about the remainder of the 1970s and into the 1980s? As I suggested a few minutes ago, the mid-1970s are often depicted as a period of political reaction during which an increasingly conservative Communist Party put an end to what remained of the 1965 Kosygin Reform. This is too simple. What I'm going to argue now is that during the 1970s, the Kosygin Reform, in the form of the Shchekino method, became firmly, even if not universally, embedded in strategies of economic management in the Soviet Union. You should probably know a little bit about the sources that I used here. I did most of my archive work in Tula and Shchekino. According to the director of the State Archive of the Tula Region, I was the first foreigner to ever conduct research in either of these repositories. My presence was interesting for at least a few people. Here you can see a photo of me from an article that ran in a local newspaper. Over the course of my time there, I was afforded a level of access to records that would surprise many specialists. These files included the minutes of trade union conferences, enterprise balance sheets, managerial orders, correspondence between the factory and various national institutions, personal papers, photographs, and others. I would be happy to talk more about this during the discussion if anyone is interested, but mostly I want you to know the sorts of materials that I'm drawing on when I make the claims that I make. Okay, back to the 1970s. Beginning with the 9th five-year plan, so that's 1971 to 1975, Soviet industrial ministries were assigned a material incentives fund, and that just means bonus fund, were assigned a material incentives fund from which subordinate enterprises derived their own. Under these conditions, ministries were permitted to maintain reserves of credits to ensure the stability of material incentives funds according to conditions of production and total sales made thanks to new production. Using 1970 as a base year, annual increases in the size of an enterprise's material incentives funds were determined through a complicated formula involving gross output, sales, production quality, and labor productivity for the duration of the five-year plan. This marked an important departure from the previous 8th five-year plan, for which no target indicators were established for labor productivity. It also encroached on the territory of the Shchekino method. The economist Yuri Chabarov went as far as to say that the goals and tactics of the 9th five-year plan and the Shchekino method to some extent duplicate one another. Writing on the state of economic reform in the early 1970s, one of Chabarov's colleagues clarified the relationship between the Shchekino method and the 9th five-year plan. For every percentage of increase or decrease in the productivity of labor, he explained, wage rates were adjusted by 0.3%. In a continuation of the second wage reform, which had got its start in 1956, and which we absolutely do not have time to cover because it's remarkably complicated, but in a continuation of the second wage reform, a December 1972 resolution of the Communist Party permitted enterprises to distribute funds economized from the release of workers among their remaining staff in the form of bonuses. In 1974, the right to utilize this system of bonus payments was extended to all enterprises, and including those who had not yet implemented the Kosygin Reform. To put it simply, Chabarov was right. By pinning the size of material incentives funds to the rate of labor productivity, giving the factory more control over the material incentives funds, and encouraging directors to grow accounts using rubles accrued through the release of labor, the ninth five-year plan in effect made it possible for any factory to adopt the Shchekino method. Perhaps as a result, some contemporaries actually credited the Shchekino method with innovating the system of planning. By the 1970s, there were two major forms of planning in the Soviet Union. The balancing method, which was the oldest and most common form, entailed negotiating the difference between what the economy demanded on the one hand and what it could potentially produce on the other. The so-called normative method posited that planning could best be accomplished via a series of elastic coefficients based on labor quotas that culminated with yearly plans, which themselves comprised five-year plans. Geo Bramov, the deputy minister of the chemical and petroleum engineering industry, saw the Shchekino method as the forebear to normative planning in the industry that he helped supervise. Beginning in the early 1970s, several dozen factories in the chemical and petroleum engineering industry replaced the quintessential element of the Shchekino method, which had been the stabilized salary fund, replaced it with normative planning. Reasoning that they shared a similar goal, which was, in his view, reducing the cost per ruble of commodity production, Abramov referred to normative planning as the further development of the Shchekino method. Echoing Chabarov, the State Committee on Labor and Wages described the method's influence most clearly when it remarked in 1976 that, quote, one of the most important elements of the Shchekino method, material incentives for work with a smaller headcount, has become an integral part of the national system of labor organization and remuneration. Data support the claim that the Shchekino method was prevalent in the Soviet Union. Between 1967 and 1975, over 47,000 workers have been released from their positions at more than 400 enterprises as a part of the Shchekino method. What happened to these workers? Consistent with the plans of the 1967 Shchekino method, they were sent in one of three directions. 52% took on vacant positions within their home enterprises. 22% went on to work in newly built workshops, and 25% moved on to new enterprises altogether. Thanks to the Shchekino method, over 500,000 workers received at least one bonus payment between 1973 and 1977 alone. Cross-training remained an important part of the experiment. At one petrochemical plant in Angarsk, for example, 1,300 workers mastered a second or third profession during the ninth five-year plan alone. But efficacy and influence on planning did not translate into even proliferation. The method was most often used in capital-intensive industries where continuous flow production and time-based remuneration were the rule. Frustrated, Vigar Buzov from the Ministry of Finance criticized the uneven spread of the Shchekino method and challenged industrial ministers to ensure its widespread introduction throughout the Soviet economy. Garbuzov's plea found support in high places. In April of 1975, Kosygin charged the State Committee on Labor and Wages and other organizations with explaining why the Shchekino method had not spread more quickly. Completed with the help of the Central Statistical Administration, the State Committee on Labor and Wages survey entailed an analysis of 326 enterprises that were using the Shchekino method. That's almost half of those that were using it by that time. The institutions found that at facilities that had adopted the Shchekino method, the rate of labor productivity increased by 6.5% against 6.1% in industry overall. 91% of this growth was a result of improved labor performance, as opposed to, for example, mechanization or automation. This figure bested industry overall by a rate of almost 14%. During the same period, this group of enterprises released a total of 14,600 workers. In accordance with Garbuzov, the State Committee on Labor and Wages and the Central Statistical Administration bemoaned that the bulk of these effects were concentrated in three industries: non-ferrous metallurgy, chemicals, and petrochemicals, where the Shchekino method had long flourished. Based on production processes alone, the State Committee on Labor and Wages argued the Shchekino method ought to have been widely used in other industries, such as ferrous metallurgy and energy production as well. And yet it remained largely absent from these industries. What other factors were at play? Well, for his part, the Ministry of Ferrous Metallurgy, IP Kazanets, had no qualms with promoting the Shchekino method. He did, however, suggest that the estimation of the number of enterprises using the method was misleading. According to Kazanets, his industry had adopted a series of measures that, when combined, approximated the implementation of the Shchekino method. But with the number of decrees that had generalized the method, there was apparently no reason to refer to the reform by its name. Quote, "At the enterprises of the Ministry of Ferrous Metallurgy, the Shchekino method has found wide application, although most of these enterprises are not considered to have switched to the method." End quote. The situation was much the same in the Tula Region. In 1977, the Tula Regional Committee of the Communist Party lamented that since 1973, the Shchekino method's dissemination had essentially ceased. But this was a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. It is true that many directors in the region had not introduced the Shchekino method in a comprehensive manner or using its name. But this was because they were already permitted to accomplish its goals to stimulate work with a smaller number of workers without any formal declaration. The spread of the Shchekino method between 1970 and 1977 was not rapid. That's true. But it would be wrong to suggest that its dissemination ceased. In fact, the core elements of the Shchekino method became available for voluntary application. This had two contradictory outcomes. On the one hand, the elements of the Shchekino method had become so commonplace that some thought it was revolutionizing planning. On the other hand, its pervasiveness could make it hard to recognize. In short, the influence of the Shchekino method was subsumed within the gargantuan task of economic management and economic planning. What is more significant, I want to suggest, is that the Shchekino method continued at all. As an offshoot of the Kosygin Reform, the Shchekino method represents an example of what I see as Kosygin's enduring influence on the shape of the Soviet system. The Shchekino method's influence peaked in the early 1980s. By then, it had been applied at over 11,000 enterprises, employing more than 21 million workers. It even made its way into Poland and into Eastern Germany. A few short years later, of course, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Some elements of the Soviet system, however, endured. Even into the late 1990s, state officials continued to talk about releasing workers for the purpose of reassigning them to another job within the same organization. The work attitudes of redundant workers soon to be dismissed remained the subject of scholarly and public interest a full decade after the end of the Soviet period. The practice of combining professions was so recognizable that it was sometimes satirized, as in a story published in 1998 about a man in Tula Region who was sentenced to 8 years in prison for combining professions during his stint as the ringleader of a gang of car thieves. More to the point, the strategy was common enough that it was regulated in the 2001 Labor Code of the Russian Federation. Written by a scholar of labor and social security law, an analysis of this same legislature published the following year described the practice of releasing workers in terms that Alexei Kosygin would have easily understood. Quote, "At present, many enterprises are practicing performing work with a smaller number of employees by combining their professions with the establishment of additional payments due to resulting savings in the wage fund." End quote. All of this occurred in the context of a domestic political economy that, as scholars such as Stephen Crowley have recently shown, even today owes its stability to state policies designed to prevent mass unemployment. What did change was how profits were used. If during the Soviet period, profits sometimes financed efforts to improve the lives of workers and their families, then in the post-Soviet period they enriched a select group that emerged victorious following the chaotic process of economic change in Russia. I won't go into the statistics now. It will suffice to say that during the 1990s, Russians experienced extreme violence, trauma, and a collapse of quality of life. Instead, I want to pivot for a moment to talk about why I think this matters to the audience. Conventional wisdom suggests that what can be known about Soviet history or contemporary Russia can best be known through analysis of the Kremlin and/or metropolitan regions such as Moscow or Leningrad, St. Petersburg. And authoritarian regimes like the Soviet Union and contemporary Russia, the upper echelons of power, most of them located in urban centers, demand attention. I have no interest in challenging this. This is absolutely true. But what I want to tell you is I think we ignore social and economic spaces like factories and geographic regions like the provinces at our own peril. Take the example of the Shchekino method. It offered workers bonus payments and improved social services. Management that utilized the Shchekino method could lay off workers. That's true. But they also were required to find these workers jobs elsewhere. You could certainly understand this entire production strategy as an attempt to improve labor production without angering or frustrating the workforce. This, of course, can be seen as an example of the Communist Party's relatively well-known insecurity, its concern that its policies might stir up anti-government sentiment. Put another way, common people in the Soviet Union, and I'm guessing in other authoritarian regimes, I'm thinking about China, for example, they had more influence and power than is sometimes assumed. There's a somewhat common saying that you'll hear from Muscovites, which is something like, is there life outside of Moscow? And to that I wish to say, yes, there certainly was during the Soviet period, and I'm going to guess that there certainly is now. Thank you for your time. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, James. That was fantastic. You were a very good storyteller. I mean, you really worked us away. I like the way you did the historical walked through. I mean, as you said, people so often just talk about the Soviet system. They say it's a command economy and that's it, right? And you actually broke down. It was fantastically done. So thank you so much. We're going to open for questions from the audience. As a reminder, and I've got a couple questions I want to ask you to start, but as a reminder, so for people who are in person, just remember you just press the little button on your microphone and that turns it on, and then turn it off afterwards. And if someone nearby you doesn't have one, please pass it. And then for our online audience, remember you can submit your questions by email or by Twitter or by Facebook, and please feel free to start sending those in now. A couple of questions I want to start with. In this excellent history and storytelling you did, one thing that I kept thinking about is incentive. What was the incentive initially, to the extent you know, and maybe you don't, but why would a factory worker in the provinces have felt motivated to change the situation if they knew they were secure in their position, right? And this actually does take effort to change things, right? And as you explained at the end, then having to get people jobs, right? What would be the motivation to do that? What was the incentive structure?
Okay, so I'm trying to answer this in two different ways. First, what's the incentive for the director of the factory, for example? And then what's the incentive for the worker? Let's talk about the worker first, because I think it's relatively straightforward. I mentioned that workers were paid bonus payments. These were not large bonus payments. The average was around 15 rubles. Up to 30 rubles, workers could not receive bonuses that were anything large, that went beyond 30% of her or his base pay. Okay, so these were not large, but they also weren't irrelevant. For example, in the mid-1970s, a kilogram of beef cost around one ruble 97 kopecks, and a worker would spend around 500 rubles to 600 rubles on clothing over the course of a year. So these are small bonuses, but they're not meaningless also. But overwhelmingly, when workers talk about their bonus, talk about the Shchekino method, talk about their experience with the Shchekino method, what they talked about was, for example, they had access to a gym that had a basketball court, had a swimming pool, for example. This is what they appreciated. They had a new campsite on the coast of the Black Sea that some of them could go visit. This is what they liked. This was significantly more important to them. Well, according to the documentary evidence, this is more important to them than simple rubles. What is it? Why would the director go about doing this? Because it's correct. This is a tough. They're immediately in a tough position. Well, the director himself also receives substantial bonuses. Of course, Shadov received the same access to the same facilities if he wanted to use them as anyone else did, but he also received rather handsome bonuses and the typical thing that came along with Soviet managers, such as prestige in local press, numerous awards and so on, being brought out in front of the Tula Region to cut a ribbon when a new gym opened up and so on. So these are the two some of the incentives that prompted them to make these.
No, that's great. And again, breaking it down, what are the material and immaterial, right? Like the break, that's fantastic. I have one other question, then I will open for the audience. And I want to go back to when you opened and you said about, you're questioning stagnation being a motivate, or that's an appropriate term to use. But could you argue that it was stagnation that prompted then, that created this incentive structure, whether it was a stagnation of material, stagnation immaterial, and people wanting something, or would that be an inappropriate or incorrect assessment?
No, I think that is actually entirely appropriate. And if anything, I think I need to write that down as a way of, to modify my own thinking about how to challenge stagnation, because I think that's entirely appropriate. And I also think, I think it's inappropriate to say that the Shchekino method may have been introduced, the Kosygin Reform. Let's go back even further than the Shchekino method. The Kosygin Reform being introduced as a way to overcome stagnation, perhaps. But I would also say that I think that the Shchekino method, as a continuation of the Kosygin Reform, is evidence that within the system from time to time, the system did demonstrate the ability to respond to problems like stagnation. Thank you for that, though.
Excellent, thank you. So let's take some questions, please, first here. And please remember to introduce yourself, too.
I have two questions and short comments. First, about the historiography of this wonderful topic. In both Soviet Union and post-Soviet historiography, we have plenty of works about Kosygin reforms and Shchekinsky method. And my first question is about the new literature. I refer to economic historians, talented historians like Yakov Feygin, whose book about reform just came out, where he discussed this, well, not in detail, but mentioned first. What's new in your research comparing to this new economic history of Soviet economy, like Yakov Feygin, wonderful book, wonderful dissertation from the University of Pennsylvania. And the second question, you already mentioned, but did not use documents of law enforcement, agencies in Soviet Union. Shchekinsky method became a kind of a red label in Soviet Union. All KGB offices, especially in provinces, try to punish people who try to make money on using Shchekinsky method. And I would recommend you, it's just common, just to go to open the directory of SBU archive in Kyiv or KGB archive. SBU is a replacement of KGB, KGB in Ukraine. And in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Plenty of them. Just go there, go to the directory and type Shchekinsky method and crimes. And you'll be shocked how many people suffered. And this again, referring to the first question about historical, because major point of Yakov book and dissertation is how Soviets actually killed opportunity to law enforcement officers. This beautiful idea of Kosygin reform to modernize Soviet economy. Thank you. So two questions and two, one at least advice.
First, thank you for the advice, and by the way, I'll say very quickly, I'll take this opportunity that I've been reading you for a very long time, Professor Zhuk, so thank you very much. And I will plead ignorance on the issue of law enforcement. I have never heard this. Thank you very much for telling me about it. Thankfully, I have a stipend for a research stipend from NYU.
The first Tsekhoviki.
Okay.
Image of this Tsekhovik came from the film Assa. You remember this?
Right.
Soviet rock bands.
Right.
I came
absolutely.
actually from not central city of Dnipro, from Ukraine.
Right.
So in Assa, we have this Tsekhovik, and many of these Tsekhoviks became entrepreneurs in Soviet economy. involved in the Shchekino method, especially in chemical production,
That's right.
fertilizers, and so on.
Right. Thank you so much for telling me about that, because I concede I did not know anything about it. But as I mentioned, I
But
get
you've seen films, us.
Of course, of course. But I'm also excited because I have a research stipend, so this sounds like a very good use of those funds. On the new literature, so I have read Yakov Fagin's dissertation was extremely important to me. It's a superb dissertation. I know that it is now in the form of a book, which I concede I have not yet had an opportunity to read. It is, I think, it's only been on a couple of
Just
months,
came
right?
out.
Right. So what I'm going to comment on is what I'm familiar with from his dissertation and from his articles, and what I think that I offer in what this project does, how it complements the literature, is that it's based almost the entirety of the project is based in a factory. And so there's no one better to have written on the way Soviet economists thought than Yakov Fagin. This is undeniable, right? And what I think I offer is, for example, close readings of, and I know you're very familiar with them, metodические указания, for example. How were these things actually implemented, right? And what did this form actually look like on the factory? So that's how I would say I complement the emerging literature. And Professor Zhuk is right. This is a really exciting time for study of the history of Soviet economy. In addition to Yakov Fagin's, Christy Ironside's book, A Full Value Ruble, is also superb, for example. And Chris Miller's books on Putin economy and Gorbachev economy.
Yeah, that was an excellent question, excellent answer. Please, next question.
So I'm Austin Gary. I'm a current Title VIII research scholar. And this might be a question that's difficult to answer from archives, but I'm just wondering about how the Kosygin reforms and the Shchekino method interfaced with informal economic practices, even on a very small scale, like blot between individual people and siphoning off things to, do remont on your own apartment, up to maybe a larger factory level where managers might be trading supplies between each other. And again, this might not be something that is even possible to answer with documents, or it might be very difficult. But that's just my question. If you have information about that.
Thank you for the question, but the truth is I have nothing on that. And I think many of us, and I'm one of them, Elena Sokina also, she's certainly one of them, are fascinated by the informal economy. But I have nothing. I'm very sorry. Right? But that's just the truth.
Apologies, I'm an anthropologist.
No,
so,
it's a great question. I wish I could answer it, but I can't. Right?
Oh, great. Other questions? Yes, please.
I wondered whether you had seen much involvement by the party at the level of particularly the OPCOM and perhaps the Central Committee department that was responsible for the chemical industry. I am thinking the RICA would be too small, but that was my question.
So yes, the OPCOM, and this is the regional Oblast Communist Party, as the question's about, was certainly involved in its proliferation, but mostly it's and I'm going back to it strikes me that the conversation between Berliner and Granick about which is, Berliner takes the position that the fundamental unit of the Soviet economy was the factory. Granick says, no, it's the industrial ministry, right? So, and I personally, I think this is a product of me maybe being someone who's after the Cold War, that my position on that has always been you can learn a lot by looking at either. Which one is most important, I don't know, right? But you can learn a lot from investigating either institution. Those were the two institutions who were overwhelmingly involved in its proliferation or in its lack of proliferation. But the OBCOM is involved. But time and again, though, the OBCOM and also the Komsomol, this will not surprise you, are both their primary role was, for example, in conducting studies, sociological studies, for example, among groups of workers to determine, okay, well, we got this surplus, what are we going to do with it? What sorts of ideas do we have to work with it?
Excellent. Next question someone has.
Hi, Joe Dresden, the Kennan Institute. How does this history evolve into Gorbachev's reforms and the Khosroshot movement?
Thank you for that question. And I think there is in my view, this is what I'm pursuing in one of the chapters. It seems to me to be a rather direct line between the Kosygin Reform and Perestroika. Professor Zhuk has a better handle on Yakov's new book, but from the dissertation, my understanding from Fagin's perspective was that what ends up frustrating Perestroika was that we have a collection of institutions, for example, heavy industry, that wield remarkable influence within the Soviet economy. This is something Khrushchev was frustrated with back with the Sovnarkhoz reforms. But you have remarkably influential and remarkably powerful institutions that themselves have an interest in the way that the economy functions one way or another. And for them, perestroika was not necessarily welcome, right? So I think there's a direct line from Kosygin. I think you could actually go back. One of the arguments I make earlier in the manuscript is that there's a fantastic article written by Kovalenko in the journal Vaprosi Istorii, in which he makes the argument that the Kosygin Reform itself was not entirely a product of the Brezhnev-Kosygin duumvirate. It was very much inspired by Khrushchev era. For example, there were two economic reforms very influential in 63, 64, Mayak and Bolshevichka. This was the Khrushchev era. Right, so I think you can draw, in fact, and I mentioned the Committee on Questions of Labor and Wages. This was born in 1955, right? It was leftover of Khrushchev's. Right, precisely. So I think that one of the things thank you for the question. I want to say first, I see a direct connection between the Kosygin Reform and Perestroika. And one of the things I'm trying to work through myself is actually going back further and making the argument that maybe we can date this all the way back to the 50s, or rather there's some logic there that's from the 50s. Thank you for the question.
Other questions or from our online audience?
I would like to add just to use local experience with Shchokinsky method and attempt of reforms from Khrushchev times. Just go to Pivdenmash, Yuzhmash enterprise, rocket enterprise in Dnipro. How they try to use this for local labs, and again, they didn't use Shchokinsky, but this is actually Sovnarkhoz from Khrushchev time, because if you analyze this, it's like results of Khrushchev, not Brezhnev per se. And I have a question. What do you think about Zastoy? Because the story was coined by Gorbachev administration. We lived with my wife through this beautiful time, stagnation. What do you think about this term? Do we need to replace this with something different, or the story stagnation? Yeah, probably it's
Right.
correct term for this.
So before Jennifer asked the question, where she posed it, and she said, James, is it possible that the Shchekino method was a response to stagnation? That was is a fantastic way of putting it, which has me now thinking about it, an asterisk on the way I'm engaging with stagnation. So let me say that. But 50 minutes ago, if someone asked me the question, that is before Jennifer posed the question, if someone said to me, James, what would you like to replace Zastoy with? I would have said history. Right? Because I think that the influence of this narrative has shaped perspective to such a degree that we are ignoring significant dynamism is not the word. Significant modifications.
Some modification or even modernization.
Modernization.
To modernize
Right.
the Soviet economy.
Right, and I actually, think of Cyril Black, for example. I think of modernization, but without the teleology.
And how détente, an American experience, Pepsi Cola, American music records, my rock and roll, how all this influence Shchokinsky, results of Shchokinsky.
This is also a fantastic question, and one of the things that I'm doing as I turn the dissertation into a manuscript is to make, in the dissertation, I make gestures towards the globe. But in the manuscript, the globe is going to be decidedly more present. And let me just give you one quick example. Everyone who has written a dissertation is familiar with the phrase, the best dissertation is a done dissertation, right? So there's a lot of material that I was not able to look through as I was completing the degree. And now that I have time to go back and look, for example, I have some documents from a collection of Mikoyan, for example, who's going to Japan and who is learning about the way Japanese factories organize labor. Now, we know about Khrushchev making his comments in his memoirs about how he was frustrated that the Japanese economy had taken off to such a degree, and he was saying, they just passed us by. We've been focusing on America the whole time, and all of a sudden now there's another competitor. But I was not aware, and I have not read any book that discusses this, but the Soviets were very well aware of the sorts of changes that were going on in factory labor organization in Japan, and these sorts of changes look a lot like the Shchekino method. Now, I'm not here telling you that the Soviet Union went over to Japan, picked up this method, came and dropped it. That's not what I'm saying. Rather, it's very much in the air. It's in the ether. In other words, what I think the heart of your question is can this be understood only domestically? And the answer is no. You're right. It has to be understood in broad terms. So thank you so much. Yeah.
Yes.
How did the Shchekino method also relate to all that work that was done by the Czechoslovak economists that led to the new economic mechanism and to Lieberman's work in Ukraine?
Another superb question. So Kosygin and Yakov talks about it a bit. It made the dissertation. I don't know if it's made the book, but Kosygin receives a rather lengthy report from some of his comrades in Germany in 1964, discussing the ongoing economic changes in Eastern Europe, and he's writing in the margins, for example, Lichna, fantastic, right? And so this follows up on Professor Zhuk's question, which is when I include the world, that also means Eastern Europe, right? And the changes that were happening in East Germany and Czechoslovakia and so on. And of course Lieberman, he features very prominently in the manuscript. Absolutely, right.
Excellent. Other questions? I can, oh, yeah.
A quick question here. So if the big picture here is about returning some agency to the factory, to the director, et cetera, and to the workers as well, did this extend also into enterprises, broadly speaking, within the military-industrial complex, or just those within the civilian sector?
Yeah, this is a great question. And let me say very quickly on the issue of workers and agency. When I referenced that a moment ago, the bulk of this text focuses on management. Right? Workers appear, of course, but I would say, time and again, what workers complain about in the factory committee meetings and in the trade union meetings generally, they say things like, and I think we can learn a lot from this, but I will be honest and tell you, I'm not sure it's that exciting. They say things like, you want me to arrive at work on time? Well, then you need to have the buses working on time, right? You don't want me to miss work? Well, then you need to have sufficient covering over the bus stop so that I'm not sitting there in torrential rain, for example. But the reason I really wanted to point out this issue of the workers and their potential agency is because I think you could read it as for example, workers were laid off. That's true. But they also had to be placed elsewhere. Right? And I think you could very much read that as the Soviet states understanding that it had to pacify its population to some degree. This is particularly true in the 50s, 60s, and so on, whenever you have a decidedly more complicated economy, like a chemical industry, for example. And you have workers who were very, very well trained, and there simply weren't many people who could do the jobs that they were doing. They could not be, frankly, abused the same way they could be in the Stalin period, for example. The question on the enterprises, this is a superb question. Where was it? Where was it? In other words, you're asking, where was it implemented and why? So we know I cannot wait for someone to write a book on the military and industrial complex in the Soviet Union. And as soon as they do it, I will be one of the first people to read it. But until then, I unfortunately I can't tell you a lot about whether or not it was used in the military. What I can tell you is that this was not an accident. You see the ratio of where it's common. Paper and pulp, chemicals, oil refining, and petrochemicals. This was a result of the labor process itself. So, chemicals, oil refining, paper and pulp, for example, they use what's called flow production. So, let's imagine I'm a chemical worker, okay? It's remarkably difficult to determine how many chemicals I produced in a given time period. So, chemical workers are almost always paid by the hour. That means that incentives payments do work on me, for example. The alternative to this is something like coal, which is batch production. They were often paid by the piece. So if I'm a coal worker, for example, I know how many kilos of coal I need to shovel. If I'm paid by the piece, if I want incentives of the type that the Shchekino method offered, do nothing for me. If I want more payment, I just shovel more coal, right? So this was not an accident. There's a very clear explanation for why it dominated in one place and not the other. I wish I could tell you about the military, and I hope someday someone will be able to, but I am not the one.
No, certainly only a suggestion, and this is not like an area of like expertise to me specifically, but in terms of thinking about the contemporary military-industrial complex or defense-industrial base, another phrase for it, in Russia, is that there is a current, labor shortage. And so the ability of basically like enterprises, factories, in order to control their workforce, those issues are essentially almost exactly opposite of like basically the time period that you're describing right now. But probably this is the first time in many decades that at the factory level, management has to understand and then manage essentially the number of places available and the relative lack of workers for them.
Oh, wow.
That may sort of harken back to these eras in which factories would have basically surplus or deficit of workers in ways that maybe in previous 5-year plans they wouldn't have had to think so, like in those ways.
Right.
So just throwing it out there.
Thank you. No, that's fantastic. And if you have a book or an article that I should read, please tell me.
It is a fascinating argument, and I keep thinking back too, just on the workers, and you may not have this information either, but I'm just curious in terms of the selection of people who were kind of, quote, laid off, right, in these different industries and where they were placed. Did you see any patterns? Like, are you, because you could make the argument you want to get rid of the better, not the best, right, better than that, or you could make the argument you want to get rid of the poorest. You could do it any different way. Did you see any of that? And then where did they end up getting placed? And did that impact those industries?
I did see a pattern. Okay, so and keep in mind that the bulk of the manuscript is on a chemical industry, is on a chemical factory. Okay, so that needs to be understood first. So chemical production involves hundreds of thousands of parts that are moving continuously, high pressurized, high temperature environment. As a result, it is absolutely normal for one machine to break down, another machine to break down here or there. And so chemical factories often had a very large number of what they called maintenance, auxiliary workers. So for the Russian speakers, it's vspomogatelny, right? They had a very large number of these types of workers. They wanted to initially lay those people off because, according to Soviet Marxist logic, we had productive and non-productive workers, right? Productive workers meaning people who are directly involved in the production process. Non-productive workers meaning everyone else effectively. So by using this logic, they wanted to target the non-productive workers, but they figured out very quickly a chemical plant cannot work without these people. So interestingly, the profession that is most often laid off within my factory anyway was chemical operators. So and it's an interesting position because on the one hand they were the productive workers, but on the other hand, because of the way production functions in a chemical factory, you cannot do without the maintenance and the auxiliary workers more broadly. So there is a pattern.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's fascinating. We are coming up on just the last minute or two. Is there a final question someone has? Question or comment? Well, maybe any concluding comments you want to give, James?
Thank you, everyone. It was a great conversation, and I've learned quite a bit from your questions and your comments, so thank you so much for that, and I look forward to my I'm excited about my trip to Eastern Europe now, to look at the legal documents. Okay, thank you guys.
Well, thank you guys.
All right,
Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Excellent discussion, and thank you again to the Department of State's Title VIII program. We look forward to seeing everyone again soon. Thank you.